Hey, what's up everyone? Raging Golden Eagle here, having way too much fun as always. I did a video about this a few weeks ago, and it turns out no one talked about it. Well, you guys who saw my video probably did, so I appreciate that, but outside of that, no one was talking about this issue. And now, what do you know, FOSTA has passed. So let's get into a little bit of what we can expect going forward. This is the measure that would make online prostitution ads a federal crime. And this part here, by the way, I have seen a little bit of attention paid to, at least when it comes to the so-called manosphere. This is what they choose to focus on. Federal prostitution ads are now a federal crime. But that's not the most important part. Most important part is this. And decimates Section 230, the federal provision shielding web publishers and platforms from certain legal liabilities for the things that users post. That's the important part. With the decimation of Section 230, pretty much anyone on the stack of companies that could be seen as having some impact on owning a website, the site owner itself, the people who own the servers they're hosted on, possibly even the ISP for all we know, they may now be held accountable for things that users post on their services. This is the truly dangerous part of FOSTA. This, I believe, is the real reason why it passed. As I mentioned in the previous video when I was talking about this, these politicians always like to tack something else on here that would make you look like a villain for being against. Oh, you're against the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act? Does that mean you're pro-sex trafficking? Oh my lord, what a villain! When in reality, it has nothing to do with the sex trafficking portion. That's not the part any of us are against. It's the extra shit like this. Making websites liable for stuff their users do on the site. And if you think this sounds like a reasonable idea, don't worry, we're going to address this in a little bit more detail towards the end of this article. So just hold your horses for a second. But first, in the absence of Section 230, the internet as we know it would shrivel, warned Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon, from the Senate floor Wednesday. Civic organizations protecting their right to free speech could be ruined by their more powerful political opponents, and there would be an enormous chilling effect on speech in America. Makes sense, doesn't it? If websites could be held responsible for what their users do on said websites, what is the logical response going to be? Obviously much stricter moderation. And I'm using the term moderation very lightly here. But now we get to another one of the important pieces. That's why big companies like Facebook like efforts like this to weaken it, Wyden added. Because it would pull up the ladder in the tech world so new companies couldn't afford to get in. Bingo. Why am I latching on to this point? 2 words, net neutrality. Remember all the spurging out about net neutrality a few months back? All the big tech companies pretty much grouped together and roused up a whole bunch of people to go protest the repeal of net neutrality because that's going to be the end of the internet. And sadly, most of those people had no clue what the hell net neutrality was even about. When you actually know, though, you start to realize why big tech rallied against it. The repeal of net neutrality would simply give ISPs more power over the big tech companies. The government pretty much said we won't step in. So obviously the big tech companies, they don't like this. But when it comes to things that could actually cause damage to the internet, as opposed to just inconvenience the big tech companies like FOSTA, either dead silence from big tech or blatant support of it. Senator Ron Wyden is absolutely correct here. Facebook has the money and the resources to deal with the fallout of this law. A startup doesn't. That means less competition for them. Good stuff, right? It's great if you're Facebook. And on top of that, all these big tech companies are constantly looking for another excuse to spy on you more and moderate you more and censor you more, and now they got it. That's why they didn't stir up another mob like they did with net neutrality. Okay, side rant aside, they then get into the fact that this actually wouldn't really do anything to fight sex trafficking. In fact, it would make fighting sex trafficking actually harder. Links in the description box below, you can check all that out if you wish. But that's not what I want to focus on here. All I feel I really need to say on the matter in the context of this video is both the Department of Justice and groups advocating for sex trafficking victims and victims themselves were against this law. That should tell you all you need to know about all the good it's gonna do, when the people it claims to protect and the people who are actually expected to enforce it are both against it. I seem to recall mentioning something like this before. It's almost as if this has nothing to do with helping sex trafficking victims, and they're just being used to push a different agenda. So I'm going to skip past that, and we're going to get to this interesting paragraph right here. This one I was not aware of at first, but if it's true, it may end up being a little bit of silver lining. Under FOSTA, any attempt by a website or app to filter out bad content could lead to more legal liability. The only way for companies to stay safe will be to completely give up on content moderation and trying to stop illegal ads from getting through. This is something I'm going to have to do a little bit more research into because it seems completely contradictory to everything else. They're going to be held liable for what happens on their site, so obviously more moderation is the solution, right? But apparently there's a loophole in this law that implies that if they do any moderation at all, then they put themselves at risk. And Senator Wyden here apparently proposed an amendment to close the loophole, but it was shot down by a large majority. As I mentioned, this could be the only silver lining here. If this loophole is true, and it actually does lead to the return of the Wild West days of the internet, then they may have unintentionally done a good thing here. But something tells me that's too much to hope for. This is one we're definitely going to have to wait and see on. Unfortunately, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't analyze this and find all the loopholes like they can. But you bet your ass, as soon as a loophole is found and companies as a whole just start avoiding this law, you know they're going to patch it up. But either way, now we get to the part I promised you earlier. If you think it's okay to hold websites accountable for what their users do on the website, you may want to be paying attention here. In a lengthy Senate floor speech on Monday, Bill's sponsor, Senator Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio, told a series of whoppers about U.S. sex trafficking, starting with an assertion that there is a federal law that now permits trafficking online, which is a blatant lie, as we are now going to get into. There isn't. And when it comes to federal law enforcement, Section 230 doesn't even apply. Without any changes to existing law, those who commit federal crimes such as sex trafficking of children, sex trafficking via force, fraud, or coercion, knowingly advertising a victim of trafficking, paying for sex with someone under the age of 18, forced labor, debt bondage, and all sorts of related activities are fully prosecutable, and Section 230 has nothing to say about it. And this is true right here. The only time you'd be protected under Section 230 is if you didn't know this was going on. If you were involved in it, or if they could prove you knew about it and didn't do anything about it, then you could be prosecutable. But now, what do they say? Ignorance is no excuse, right? Going back to the example I used in my previous video. Let's say 2 Twitter users were performing sex trafficking via private messages. Twitter could now be held liable for that. All this law is going to do is make sure that they much more closely and much more quickly monitor all the content going through their site, and even take a whole bunch of preemptive measures with a whole bunch of mass bans. So you could see this on Reddit already. They've shut down multiple subreddits, like funny enough, even the shoplifting subreddit, and used FOSTA as their excuse. Nobody knew about FOSTA, nobody was talking about it, again, because big tech wasn't around to rile up a mob. But the day it passes, subreddits are being shut down, and now suddenly everyone cares. Funny how that works out, isn't it? But here's the whopper right here. If having heard everything I just said, if you are still of the opinion that even if you didn't know about it, websites need to be held responsible for sex trafficking, how do you respond to this? And yet, Portman isn't introducing legislation to hold the street corners or the government entities who own them accountable as sex traffickers when prostitution takes place there. Boom, headshot, mic drop, all that shit. That is the big point right there. If you're going to hold websites accountable for crimes that are committed by users on the website, then you need to hold the owners of these street corners accountable for crimes that are committed on these street corners. Or if you're an apartment building owner, if one of your tenants just happens to be a pimp that's pimping girls out from his apartment, guess who's responsible now? You can see where this is going, can't you? This shit wouldn't fly in meat space, why are we letting it fly online? And the proponents of this law have no argument against this. How can you with a straight face say that a website owner needs to be held accountable for sex trafficking done on the site, but the owner of an apartment building or a street corner where sex trafficking is going on isn't accountable? Though now that I think about it, there's probably a good reason we don't hear this argument more often. Because given the current year government, their response to this will probably be, hey, that's a good idea. We need to hold the owners of the street corners and the apartment buildings accountable. The answer is always more government and more regulation after all. We know that's the route they would take. But before I sign off, there's yet another little bit of silver lining. Although in this case, it's really just potential good news. The bright side is that there's a strong chance this bill will run into trouble in the courts. Unlike the SAVE Act, which prohibits the knowing advertisement of trafficked sexual services, this statute implicates constitutionally protected speech. So if we're lucky, the courts are going to strike it down. But unfortunately, that probably means this BS law is going to be on the books for years before that happens. It takes a long-ass time for something to make it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and you know they would take this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And even then, it may only be partially taken down, little bits at a time. And even then, that implies someone had the time and the money to actually fight this all the way to the Supreme Court. And that actually leads into the biggest problem I have with the US legal system, actually. The government and large corporations abuse this fact all the time. Even if they are in the wrong and you are 100% in the right, they can afford to drag these court cases out for years. You can't. So guess who's gonna win by default? So even if this law does ultimately, eventually get struck down by the courts, we're stuck with it for long enough that its effects will definitely be seen. That's all I gotta say, guys. Thanks for listening.